This is our first seminar, so I will repeat what I invariably say at our first seminar, which is, where's Sarah? Anyway, which is, that these are really very much meant to be extremely informal, and that we'd like our fellows always to feel that they can sort of put adventurous ideas on the table and not be criticised for doing so. We'd like you to be able to put half-baked ideas and just thoughts and experimental things. And then the idea really is just to spend about 20 minutes putting ideas on the table and then hoping that you will get from all kinds of different disciplinary directions some useful input. So that is in a nutshell. And we don't do formal introductions for our seminars, we save that for your public lecture. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sarah to talk to us about uterine dreams. So over to you.
Ronan, are you going to press the button to play the presentation? Great. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been quite a journey to create this project. It's all absorbing. It's very personal. So, I'm really looking forward to your input because as Ludmilla knows, I work very collaboratively. So whatever comes out of today's discussion will end up in the work. So thank you all.
My name is Sarah Danays, and I'm a sculptor and photographer. It is a privilege to be with you today, though remotely, and I thank Durham University's Institute of Advanced Study, my academic collaborator, Professor Ludmilla Jordanova, the university's Centre for Visual Arts and Culture, and its Oriental Museum for this remarkable opportunity to further my work and deliver for Durham the 2021 virtual exhibition Uterine Dreams. There is a part of us that is unknowable even to ourselves. Heraclitus, the 6th century BCE Greek philosopher, knew this. He also knew that if a journey were to be made to find this unknowable part, with any arrival unlikely, that it would be downwards. I have been climbing down towards this unknowable place for a long time. Why? Because I believe it is there, down there, that I will be able to address and correct damage. My singularly personal practice is a byproduct of this journey, the road to individuation, as Carl Jung described it, and who wrote to his dying friend, Dr. Christine Mann, "Whatever you do, if you do it sincerely, will eventually become the bridge to your wholeness, a good ship that carries you through the dark of your second birth, which seems like death from the outside." My work, the metaphysical surgery I undertake, is that bridge to my wholeness. It is where and how I address that which is not whole in me, that which has been broken. For this operation to achieve its purpose, to correct damage, I bring to my practice absolute clarity of intention and integrity of motive. This is Jung's steer of sincerity. My art has become the mechanism by which I reach to the core of myself. It winches me down to as close as I can get to that unknowable part, the rock face, and then with unyielding discomfort shines its beam to reveal the fault lines, my many fissures. In this light, a fragile condition is evident. But for any effective repair to be achieved, a correct assessment of the damage and how it came about must first be made. Who possibly, though, could provide such a service, a correct diagnosis? No one, least not yet. So I take a look at the damage myself and slowly devise a method of care. There are several disciplines to my method, my metaphysical surgery, which I will elaborate on for my public lecture, saving the relationship between my sculpture and its photography for the Uterine Dreams exhibition essay. But in these few minutes today, I am concentrating on the two core elements, research and antiquarian objects, notably broken ones. Your contributions following this seminar are part of a process that will help determine Uterine Dreams' best success. I have actually always worked with collaborators, mostly dead ones, but some alive. To the list of live ones, I'm honoured to add my academic collaborator for this project, the esteemed historian, Professor Ludmilla Jordanova. It's an appropriate alliance, as my work involves extensive research. Learning about an object's history and cultural and social context, and the religious, philosophical and aesthetic ideas of its time, is an essential part of my process. I'm led to archives, to curators, artists, usually dead ones, ecclesiastical libraries, antique dealers, gemologists, geologists, writers, mystics, scientists, psychiatrists, academics. All are searched for insights into a subject and object's history to allow me to develop new interpretations for significant museum pieces, like the British Museum's Portland vase, and to inform the treatment of broken objects, antiquities from my own collection. Why broken antiquities? Because like humans, objects break. And I believe, like humans, objects break or are broken physically and emotionally. The broken spirit, the broken heart, the broken home, the broken body, the broken mind are all summed up in fragmentation, brokenness, the poignancy of a part removed, forcibly or accidentally, from something that was once whole. An object, particularly an old broken one, carries with it, provenanced or not, all its history and associations from when it was made, that is, those contemporary to its time, as well as, I believe, the residue of the experiences of its lifespan. These experiences can often be seen in the patina of its age, chips, dents, missing pages and pieces, but sometimes they cannot. I like to think that certain objects absorb their experiences. What might make one object more absorbent, give it more resonance or connection with a human than another? Perhaps it is the amount of concentrated attention an object receives, a build-up of devotion that has seeped in, or the intent of how it was made. I've been searching out old things, old objects, since my curate father gave me a £5 note to spend at that year's missionary sale. This was more than 25% of his weekly wage, a family of 4 living on £16 a week, so the pressure to spend it well, to find something good, was considerable. Obviously, before leaving the house, I had to listen again to the parable of the talents, with particular emphasis given to the tasks set out for those 3 servants. Broken things cost less than perfect things, and old things cost less than new things, I learnt at the age of 6, so I bought good quality, in my infant opinion, broken old things. Life wasn't happy at home, so these precious things, given to me by my father, became my friends. In their shameless, unconcealed brokenness, particularly the little broken bodies, usually Jesus's, I found companions willing to absorb those internalized, concealed feelings within myself. I can still see the field behind the church, full with white-topped tables and animated parishioners, and in my mind's eye, as I move closer to the pious bric-a-brac, I feel again that first rush of adrenaline. I remain attracted to broken sacred objects, preferably fragmented body parts, and particularly hands. I will expand on the use of gesture in my work for my public lecture. It may take me several years to find the right object from the right person in the right set of circumstances to combine with a traumatized object. These are the ones that give me the same sensation I felt when rescuing those legless, crippled saints from missionary sails. Tara was my first Los Angeles patient, who I rebuilt in 2011. The piece is named after the yellow female bodhisattva, Tara, also known as the Mother of Liberation. The arm's provenance reads that it came from a life-size bronze gilt statue forged in 17th century Tibet. During the Cultural Revolution, she was knocked down by Red Guard troops, her body dismembered under caterpillar tracks. 2 arms were rescued. This is one of them. For more than 10 years, I have been carving with hand tools, metamorphic marble, and sedimentary alabaster. When I came to carve an appendage to dam up the trauma Tara's severed arm had experienced, I chose a small, rare piece of agate alabaster for her metaphysical surgery. Alabaster is low on the Mohs scale of hardness, 1.5 to 2, with diamond at 10. It is a stone so gentle that it grazes into powder, dissolves in water, disintegrates when heated, and breaks easily along its many fissures. Fragile, powdery, porous, with a propensity for bruising, the nature of this stone is in rhythm with the broken objects I apply it to. Its female, nurturing associations and history are also in rhythm. The fragility and sensitivities of this complex material have a kinship with skin, something I believe medieval sculptors understood. Just as skin when grazed forms a healing scab, alabaster oxidizes when exposed to the air. Each new, freshly carved surface is soft, vulnerable, until it grows its patina, its scab. Appreciating by association with Mary Magdalene its sacred nature, I work it with the utmost respect. My consultant gemologist and precious metals expert further informs me that the enlightened ancient alchemists, knowing the stone's capacity to hold water within its structure, understood it, alabaster, to carry the soothing metaphysical properties of water. In this, alabaster was deemed capable of absorbing emotion and offering peace to troubled hearts and minds, the two places we most readily associate with emotional disturbance. Marble may have been the more enduring tomb, but alabaster, a more certain place to rest in peace. Tara and Stigmata, 2013, demonstrate the eclectic mix of objects and ideas that come together in my studio, where I undertake my surgery. Here, fragments of sacred and secular objects, previously separated by different countries, cultures, centuries and religions, are intermingled with marvels from nature and my own alabaster and marble carvings, or work of past anonymous sculptors, my dead collaborators, to create complete sculptures or sections of sculptures. These combinations create a unique fusion of energies and symbols. It is this fusion that provides the metaphysics to my surgery. The parallels between this process and the ways in which psychotherapists work with their patients are suggestive. The research I refer to into an object's past to better inform my approach to its repair are similar to that of a therapist, as I endeavour to make whole a broken object, so I address my own repair and the work it requires. The 20th century American psychologist Carl Rogers, whose work championed Jung's, developed the person-centered approach. It is in the knowledge of the patient, through a nurturing process of inquiry, with a choice and empathetic sharing of a therapist's own personal experience, that a stronger bond of repair is formed, a technique pioneered by Rogers. It was through the hard work of a specialist PTSD therapist that I was able to navigate a way of rebuilding my own life, continue to work as an artist, and deliver Uterine Dreams for Durham. As my therapist at Rubicon Cares, the Kent charity which supports individuals affected by crime and trauma, put it, the relationship is the therapy. Though not an exact parallel, the sculptures I make and their photographic counterparts are metaphors for this therapeutic relationship. In combining the human, fragmented, sculpted body parts with the non-human, corals, gems, bluebirds, I'm able to make entities that are altogether new and whole. The internal, invisible journey I take for my objects and for myself is similar to that of the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve, which in women travels from the brain to the heart and down to the uterus, connecting up the mind-body orgasm in women and in men, influencing their sexual arousal. Pertinent to my surgery is the understanding of the significance of this nerve in emotional regulation and the treatment of intransigent, treatment-resistant depression. Since 2009, surgeons have been able to fit a pacemaker-like device in the chest, internally linking it to the vagus nerve in the neck, a device which sends pulses of electricity into the nerve, which transmits them to the brain. For reasons that doctors don't completely understand, these electrical impulses, transmitted via the vagus to the brain, are able to relieve the symptoms of depression. Perhaps someone here might understand why. For my latest body of work, Uterine Dreams, I am forced to stare into a place that I would rather not look. In the research and work required to deliver this fellowship's exhibition, I address the sorrow and grief, absence and loss, emptiness, in the part of the body, the womb, that has been deemed central to womanhood. In carving the exhibition's title piece, an 18-centimetre high alabaster truncated female torso, its lower legs broken off, I lay to rest my marriage and the choices made for me by another. The absence of the lower legs in my sculptural self-portrait and my reference sculpture, a travertine Greco-Roman female torso from the university's Oriental Museum archives, is significant. To be without arms, harmless, and with broken legs forces a recumbent position of absolute passivity, devoid of all personal agency. It was Professor Jordanova who introduced me to the 18th century Scottish anatomist and obstetrician William Hunter. Hunter went further than broken legs, choosing to saw them off to gain closer access to the most intimate areas and wombs of his dead collaborators. The anatomical pregnancies engraved in Hunter's 1774 gravid uterus, some cast life-size in plaster, will be re-examined as I remember my own body's inability to hold a pregnancy. It is these captured abortions, miscarriages and full-term pregnancies that I will be carving in alabaster, alabaster being, for reasons you now appreciate, the correct material from which to carve an amniotic sac, while the act of carving has similarities with apoptosis, the orderly removal of cells in the developing fetus to shape fingers, toes. I am to sculpt 3 of Hunter's engravings, life-size to my own approximate scale and in the round, a pitifully small memorial to the 35 to 40 women Hunter captured in his pages, who were cut, anonymously engraved, and then forgotten. If any of their remains, bones, survive, then all but 4 lie in unnamed, unknown graves. Meanwhile, Hunter's sacred memorial stone rests in St. James's, Piccadilly, London, and conspicuously remembers him, celebrated as a physician and physiologist. My morbid research into pregnancy and maternal death has led me to ancient Greece, where I am rewarded in full for the journey, in the myth of Coronis and Apollo and the first recorded caesarean section. Writing in The Metamorphosis, Book 2, Ovid tells that Apollo loved the nymph Coronis from Thessaly, till her guilt he knew. News fed to him in his absence by the snowy raven he'd charged as her companion, the prattling bird, its feathers turning black as Apollo hears of his lover's infidelity. Reports differ on who shot the fatal arrow. Pindar attributes Artemis, hired by her twin brother, but Ovid writes that it was Apollo who lodged an arrow in Coronis's tender breast. Consistent with both poets, though, is that the mortal Coronis, in the god's long absence, had been intimate with, seduced by, perhaps, a local human lover, and unbeknownst to either men, she is pregnant with Apollo's child. Now dying, Coronis appeals to the life of her innocent son, and Apollo, weeping and full of remorse as he builds her funeral pyre, rips from her dead womb their child. This is why Apollo lies weeping on the broken dreams of gods and infidels. Strange, though, that even at close range it wasn't evident to Apollo that Coronis was pregnant. She had to tell him. A pregnancy bump normally becomes visible early in the second trimester, between 12 to 16 weeks of pregnancy. Further, obstetricians only consider a fetus viable, capable of surviving outside of the womb, at 24 weeks. As an aside, I'm told by lucid dream expert, psychologist and parapsychologist Dr. Keith Hearn, that the fetus starts a dream, repetitive eye movement detected, at 23 weeks. Apollo names his tiny son Asclepius, meaning to cut, and though the god is associated with medicine and healing, chooses for his son's care the home of the centaur, Chiron, famed for his skill with medicine and herbal remedies. Asclepius is taught everything the centaur knows of the healing arts, who is also gifted in music, hunting, and prophecy. The pupil's skills soon eclipse his master's, and the applied combination of medicine and prophecy become Asclepius's signature treatment, the healing ritual of dream incubation and the manifestation of prophetic dreams. Now we understand why Socrates, given agency over the time of his death and the taking of his own life on account of a prophetic dream, instructs his friend, Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget. It was on account of Penelope's speech in Homer's Odyssey that the ancient Greeks understood prophetic dreams to be reached through the sleep gates of burnished bone, horn, and false dreams through the gates of ivory. Aeneas' perilous descent to Hades to reach the spirit of his dead father, Anchises, requires he take with him the golden bough, the sacred branch his mother Venus and his guide Sibyl the prophetess help secure for the journey. This branch he surrenders to the ferryman in exchange for crossing the river Styx. Complexities arise when Virgil, writing in Book 6 of the Aeneid, tells of Aeneas and Sibyl's departure from the underworld, escorted by his father through the ivory gate of false dreams. The golden bough is widely considered to be mistletoe. The word mistletoe is related to the Latin name of Asclepius and also means what is hanging from the edible oak, or esculent, good to be eaten. Might we assume then that Asclepius made potions from it to encourage prophetic dreaming, and if so, what meaning has this for Aeneas crossing over to the Deadlands? Is he sleeping or awake? Interesting too is that he is aided by an oracle, compelled only to know and speak the truth. In the myth of Aeneas, I am reminded of Jung's advice to his dying friend, that truth, sincerity, is a requirement for the journey towards wholeness, which in turn is preparation for the transition to the next world, the crossing over. I remember too that Jung was the unhappy child of a poor pastor. It is widely recognized that those who have struggled to survive and then to heal are often those who wish to help achieve the same for others. This seems to be the case for the orphaned Asclepius, born from trauma to become the god of healing, truth, and prophecy. In her 2009 essay for the Annals of General Psychiatry, Medicine and Psychiatry in Western Culture, Ancient Greek and Modern Prejudices, Michel Fonaro notes that ancient Greek medicine was a complex practice perceived as something between myth and reality, as an expression of magical divinatory, hieratic and empirical technical practice. Humbly, in the small ritual of my own metaphysical surgery, I find resonance with this complex practice, where no differentiation was made between psychic and somatic conditions, between the seen and the unseen, the psychological and the magical. Fonaro uses the word magic, appropriately so for ancient Greece. In my Common Era studio, I prefer to use the word mystical, with its goal of personal transformation and connections with symbolism, the outward sign of an inward meaning, which, along with those parables, I grew up with. My healing work, exacted as a route to wholeness, has also acted as a code for me, allowing me to make objects and images that address difficult subjects with stealth and subtlety, the acceptable face of the unacceptable. Tourniquet 2007 shows a single left arm separated in time by an act of violation, the first positioned in defence of an imminent blow, the second after it. It symbolises violence, specifically to a woman. Coronis could not defend herself against Apollo's fatal arrow, and this for me is the seminar's connecting vagus nerve, which runs between Coronis, William Hunter's suspected abductees, and what is expressed in my own work. It is that of body ownership, abuses of power, coercion, violence. Olivia Turnbull of the V&A Sculpture Department correctly notes that my practice isn't about making the viewer uncomfortable, rather it is about examining violence, the fragments that remain or do not, and reforming them. My sculptures, in their stillness, speak not only of damage and loss, physical, emotional, and psychological, but also of rebuilding through their conspicuous repair and new associations. Now, through this most positive practice, my metaphysical surgery, I work to soothe those broken uterine dreams.
Sarah, that was absolutely beautiful exposition of the connection between brain, heart, and it is absolutely illuminating to hear artists kind of just unfold their work with such clarity. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you.
Really, I'm now totally fascinated. So I won't leap in first. I'm sure there must be other questions pending. Nick, I see your hand come up promptly there. You're muted.
You're muted.
Nick, you need to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, no, I knew that. Sorry, I have a rather slow screen response here, I'm afraid, and so I was busy tapping away with my index finger. Sarah, thank you so much for that. I thought that was extremely rich and almost too multi-dimensional for me to say something about the whole thing in itself. There were simply too many resonances. So just a comment and a question, if I may. The comment is, I thought you really touched the nerve of the age when you were focusing in, as it were, on your primal scene of the power of statuary. And I'm thinking here of BLM, Black Lives Matter, of course, and the way people on the streets feel compelled to tear these things down and break them.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a different kind of statue from the one that you're talking about. But it is noticeable that the kinds of statues which the BLM people have been taking down are always in the classical tradition. The classical tradition which Sarah Danays tends to focus on as well. And their power depends in many ways on their claim to expressing classical human fulfillment. They're whole, they're harmonious, they're autonomous, they're at rest with themselves, and they have an appeal to universality as well. And of course, if they get that wrong, they offend a quarter, half, 95% of humanity, and they tear it off the pedestal, of course. Now, that's really just a platform for a question to you. And the question is, and I'll follow it up with just an example, if I may. The question is it possible, you emphasize the therapeutic function of your statuary, and there's a great tradition of that in art as well, Schiller and so forth. How far is it possible for art to pursue a therapeutic function? Can that wholeness ever been attained? And the example that I wanted to mention of that, just a couple more sentences on this, if I may, is the German Romantic tradition. The German Romantic tradition, by definition, is anti-classical. German Romantics invented their own genre, and they called it the fragment. They didn't believe that wholeness could be embodied. They did awful things to each other's work. They believed that the work of art didn't have a singular author. They rewrote each other's work. They tore it apart. Clemens Brentano wrote a very famous short story beginning with the word ... but. So you had to work out where it might have been coming from, and so on and so on and so on. That's what romantic irony is about. It's all a huge provocation saying that art cannot embody that wholeness. We have to deal with our fragmentary mode of existence. And the path to that the path to overcoming that is asymptotic. At best, it's an approximation to a place, an ideal place we want to go, but may never reach. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it. I was beginning to think that Sarah Danays is perhaps a bit of a German romantic.
I really believe in the power of the fragment. I think that it's a much more powerful communicator because it doesn't confine your mind to just locate itself within one thing, and you bring together all your remarkable associations. So for me, the fragment really would be much better for me always to work in fragment than in the whole body form. And it wouldn't carry my message correctly either. But also the fragment, it can hint so romantically or so beautifully at things. You can be, I think, so much more nuanced with a fragment than with a whole idea. So that's why I use it in my work. And in fact, I do talk about the fragment quite a lot.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll talk about this.
Yes, very much so.
Thanks, Sarah. I think Laszlo's hand came up there.
There are just a couple of small things that came to my mind. The first, it's a big thank you. I think it was just really a very cathartic half an hour to listen to your presentation. So it's really fabulous, and I'm very much looking forward to see the whole exhibition and more pieces of the art. Okay, on the fragments. So you had a couple of quotes, ideas from the Greek philosophers, especially from the pre-Socratic tradition. Now, these are all, as we know, are fragments. So even though Kirk and Raven published it under the title of pre-Socratic philosophers, if you look back to the earlier publication, Diels and Krantz, the work was called The Fragmented Pre-Socratic Philosophy, or the fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophy, or the fragmented for Socratica. Quite clearly, the big Greek tradition was not to preserve long pieces of essays, but ideas, and ideas, and it went until basically Socrates, because only after Socrates we are aware of completed pieces of work. On the other hand, if you go back even to the 20th century, I think a certain Ludwig Wittgenstein had this interesting idea that basically anything he wrote is a piece of fragments composed in a particular manner. And the other big great German philosopher of the 20th century, Heidegger, if you look at the most important work, the Sein und Zeit, is part 1. And apparently the part 2 was never written. So that's also a very important sign that we always have to face this sort of fragmentation of the world. Now, here is I think the Heidegger idea brings something really new to the picture that what I would like to discuss, because it's a fragment, not because this is only what is left to us, but a fragment because it was never completed. So the big issue, what I think is basically brings us back to Plato in a large extent, whether the wholeness ever existed, whether there was a state where the soul was not damaged, was not broken. And I think that's a very interesting question, because especially in the first part of your presentation, the wholeness in the past is presupposed. On the other hand, it can be seen as a kind of a journey to figure out whether it ever existed.
Yeah.
Because if you reconstruct it, if you rebuild it, then the whole rebuilding process, the reconstruction process, might be the construction rather than the reconstruction.
Ah, beautiful. Wow. Thank you very much. Gosh, thank you. I named my Schnauzer Ludwig after Wittgenstein. Thank you. There's a lot to think about there. I would really like to develop all this philosophical side of things. And of course, Heraclitus, you know, his writings are recorded in fragment. So yes, I love all of this. Thank you very much.
Anyone else wanting to jump in there? I'd like to talk about relics, actually.
Oh yes.
Because your comments about fragments make one think about the sort of the power of those very tiny fragments that relics tend to constitute, and yet they are extraordinarily powerful objects, which takes us to a more general thing. And I suppose this is a more kind of anthropologically comparative view, is the sort of cultural notions of the agency of objects and how they hold power and how they can act upon the person. And then that seems to me a sort of way in which one could kind of situate your thinking in some really very different cultural perspectives about how objects hold memory, are residual, hold power, have identity, carry personhood forward in time, and so forth. And there's some lovely examples of thinking in that. And as an anthropologist, because I'm always slightly anxious about the sort of notion of the Hellenic civilization being the first civilization, because of course I work with people who have tremendously sophisticated hunter-gatherer notions about objects and how they have power and sentience and meaning, and can carry and can do things in that kind of way. And that connects with the other point that I want to make, because you referred to that notion of the nether world and the dream world, and the way in which that there's, you know, that kind of movement between the two. And I think that for many cultural groups, particularly in sort of, you know, nature worshipping era, the movement between the metaphysical and the physical and the conscious and the subconscious is much less divided. Actually, there's a lot of slippage movement. So people would adopt different forms. They would visit other worlds quite readily through trance and ritual. And so there was always this potential to bring the metaphysical into the physical world. And there's that sense of presence and sentience in the physical world as well, which is kind of like a context for objects of power. But I think the point that it's processual is also really interesting. Of course, Heraclitus is most famous for saying you step in the same river twice. So this is all about change over time as well, and the power of objects to move through time and acquire meaning. So there's a lovely book by Arjun Upadhyay called The Social Life of Things, which talks about how objects move through time and space and are given meaning as they move. And so the potential to tie that in with processes of healing is very real. So that's my first off thoughts. I'll stop there because I'm sure there may be other questions. Then I'd like Ludmilla to get a chance to jump in as well, and Harriet if she would like to.
Thank you very much. We've got lots to talk about.
I'm happy to wait for Harriet.
Hi, I had a question, but I'm not very good at phrasing things sometimes, so I put it in the chat.
Oh, let's have a look down here. I'm new to all this Zoom. Let's have a look. Oh, here we go. Yes. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Can everybody read this as well?
Yeah.
I got a glimpse of it. Something about women being seen as easily broken.
Yes, the depictions of female pregnancy anatomy. Yes. Oh, yes. It's a very good question. Very good question. It's quite likely that many of those women were prostitutes and might have been sourced from the countryside and abducted. So they weren't society ladies. There are 4. Ludmilla will know a lot more about this than me, but there were 4 that are named. So that's where we would know where their remains are left. But the rest are anonymous. I actually think that I kind of make a point of focusing on fragility. But I mean, Frida Kahlo, people like that, I mean, those are very powerful women, and that kind of how women are depicted as powerful, controlled women, not controlled, in charge of their lives, sort of women. But I mean, one of my favorite things or sculptors is, are you familiar with Camille Claudel? Do you know her work?
I do, yeah.
Yes. So she was for a while Rodin's muse, and actually carved most of his hands and feet for his sculptures. And of course, she was depicted as a crazy wild woman and never probably recognized at all, but yet her work is indistinguishable from the quality of Rodin's. So I think that I would love to write about that as well. Yeah, I think, I mean, yes, I think, and at that point, I think there was so much competition between the anatomists and the doctors at the time. And I actually think that they were so completely focused on their careers and advancing, medical industry, or sorry, medical profession, that I don't know that it really crossed their mind too much. But I don't know, that's just me supposing ideas, isn't it? Ludmilla, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think a lot of the discussion does raise a question that was implicit in, and indeed once made explicit in your paper, which is about the context in which the phenomena that you're drawing on arose, and how much emphasis we need to give to the context of each of these episodes. So for me, it's very interesting to hear Nick talk about German Romanticism. And then I want to understand something about the societies in which German Romanticism arose and then was reproduced. And I'm a great leader enthusiast, so I'm very interested in what it means to take some of these texts and turn them into musical occasions. So, I mean, there are lots of ways in which transformations are at work, but I do think we always have to have the context. And I don't think we know why Hunter cut off the legs. It wasn't you said it made it easier for him to have access, but I think we don't know that. I mean, it's not necessarily a practical thing. And of course, he was an extraordinary collector. So he owned lots of the things that you're talking about. So one way to understand Hunter might be to think about the kinds of things that he collected. So I think there is a bit of a challenge for people like you to work out how much emphasis you want to give to the different contexts. I'm not in any doubt that, you know, fragmentation is one of the most important themes we have, full stop. And as it happens, there is someone in the classics department at Durham who is very interested in that. She's called Nora Goldschmidt. She's currently on leave because she has an AHRC grant, but she's someone that you might like to make contact with and see if you can have a conversation. So I think this goes in lots of different directions. I think in terms of producing something lasting, which we're going to do with the catalogue, we perhaps need to make some decisions. I'm also very taken by Veronica's points, because things in agency is one of the big debates. And, you know, I can suggest some reading on that. A couple of years ago, we had a conference in Cambridge about one of the best known anthropologists who wrote about this, Alfred Gell. And I think there's a lot to get one's teeth into there, including at a more philosophical level, because it's about, he wrote about how we can understand things having agency. And I think that is quite a dense and tricky question here. Yeah. So, I mean, those are my thoughts immediately. And Nick, I wonder if you might suggest a couple of items of reading that Sarah could do on German Romanticism. And yes, I mean, Laszlo, perhaps the same. I mean, something that might extend what Sarah's been saying. But obviously, I'm delighted that you think this so interesting. And I guess one of the points we ought to make is that, of course, Sarah has a kind of liberty that those of us who are academics don't have. I mean, she can say, I'm going to take from here and there and put it together in a beguiling way. And the fact is, it's difficult to get a PhD if you do that, unless it's in a very particular context. So I think one of the things we might want to think about is the relationship between those of us who are academics and people like Sarah, who can perhaps think and represent differently because they have this freedom.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this whole fragmentation thing.
Nick, I think I saw your hand come up there, and Rob, I missed you.
I got there about a tenth of a second before Laszlo. Sorry about that, Laszlo. Yeah. Yes, of course, I'm happy to provide, obviously, a handy-sized bibliography, Sarah. Obviously not at this moment, but we'll email about that. And yes, I have to say I've loved everybody's comments, including Laszlo's. I'm looking forward to his next one as well. I wondered, I thought Ludmilla, who knows about these things as well as aesthetic discourse, might have mentioned it. That's not a criticism, Ludmilla, don't worry.
I'm waiting.
All of us know that you're a qualified scientist.
Me?
And yeah.
Ah, right.
Yes. You may remember that.
A long time ago.
But yes. Well, I'm a great fan of these people with dual qualifications. But one of my personal persuasions, which I think is perhaps slowly gaining ground in the collective mind, is that aesthetic discourse, by which I mean all forms of art, by which I mean the stuff you do, Sarah, and also the stuff the German Romantics wrote, possesses intrinsically, by contrast, say, to mathesis, putting things in numbers and processing them according to mathematical and arithmetic logic, statistics, and so on and so forth. And in addition to, as it were, non-aesthetic discourse, so formal, propositional form, all of these are recognized modes of evidencing truth in, I don't know, syllogisms or something or other. But there is a whole tradition. Adorno is only one of the later people to iterate this, to reiterate this, of course, pointing out that aesthetic discourse reaches parts of the truth which other forms of discourse do not. Now, Adorno would have said that had to be reduced to propositional form, but there are other modes which think of hybrid discourses where, for example, you can talk in aesthetic discourse about the truth of natural science. And you can provide a valid criticism of them. Foucault, and then going backwards a long way to modern Germans like Nico Petesch and Josef Vogel and people like that. And I'll give you all their stuff as well. Is there a discourse? Are you criticizing science in your aesthetic discourse as well, Sarah?
I don't think that I am. I think when I very first read Ludmilla's brilliant sexual visions, I started to feel quite negatively about things. But as I've done more and more research into these engravings, I'm having to get ready to carve all these, it sounds awful, but yes, the abortions and the miscarriages. I'm having to do so much research. And I'm actually finding myself much more comfortable in that world now. And all these amazing similarities. I mean, I mentioned about the amniotic sac and alabaster, but then apoptosis and how that relates to carving. So I'm finding all this really interesting. And I actually would like to become a lot more informed. And I mean, I do have my concerns about William Hunter and his motives, because of course he was in competition, wasn't he, with the Smelly? I don't know how to pronounce that. Ludmilla will know, I think. But anyway, I can't hear Ludmilla actually.
It's a Smiley, I think.
Smiley, that's it. Sorry, yes, that's it. So I think it's what I'm finding very exciting about what I'm working on now is that it's just such an enormous field. It's just enormous. I could go in any direction here. So I will have to focus down. I know I've got 45 to 50 minutes for the public lecture to develop different areas. And actually, I'd quite like to weave in, because I mean, in my abstract, it was more of an emotional response to the subject I was dealing with. But I'd like to draw in ideas of romanticism and what that means, on an everyday basis as well. So I think it's going to get really dovetailed now. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your reading list.
Sounds like it's going to be quite a heavy duty one. Wonderful. Anybody else want to jump in there? Rob, I think Ronan gave me a note that you had your hand up earlier, but you weren't on my screen. So okay. Did you want to jump in?
Thanks. Yes, I'm risking using my video, although I've had connection issues, but hopefully it'll hold up. I've got a quick comment about the vagus nerve and a question about fragmentation. So I was really interested in your comments on the vagus nerve, actually, and in particular, it's one of the structures that's central to the kind of new and emerging perspective in psychology and cognitive neuroscience. That's kind of anti-Cartesian. It's about embodiment and the way in which the mind, consciousness, the self, cognition are rooted in the body and bodily responses. And the vagus nerve is a really kind of central structure in that kind of conceptualization. And people are actually beginning to do some work on it. I don't know if that would be of interest to you. So people like Damasio, Antonio Damasio, he had this idea called the somatic marker hypothesis, which is really along the lines of what I've been describing it as a movement in cognitive science. Wow. This embodiment of sense of self and cognition and so on. And he's actually done some work stimulating the vagus nerve, which is quite interesting, and suggests that it's pretty crucial in terms of our responses to the world and our decision making. So that was just a quick comment, and if you're interested, I could.
I'm really interested, because that was actually one of the few kind of questions that I put into my presentation. If anybody can tell me, because apparently these doctors that are putting in this electrical charge into the chest that links up to the vagus nerve and then shoots more electrical charges up to the brain, they don't actually know why it's working to treat depression. It just is. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the reason why people, it's not necessarily obvious to people why that sort of thing works is because we still tend to kind of at least implicitly subscribe to a rather Cartesian view of what cognition is, as being separate from the body. But in exploring, you know, the bodily connections of consciousness, where, you know, that provides a framework that will help us understand those kinds of effects in interesting ways, I think. Anyway, yeah, Mike, so I've got a question also about fragmentation. I really loved what you were saying about that. And
thank you.
This idea that sort of to have something that is too complete is kind of constraining, and that actually almost the process of making us fill in the gaps is really crucial in our response to work such as yours. And I was wondering though, so if you have a kind of a continuum from, you know, completeness to incompleteness, from fragmentariness to completeness, is there some kind of optimum that you're aware of when you're producing work, but on that continuum? Presumably, if something was too fragmentary, it would be meaningless because there just wouldn't be enough there to get purchase on. But if it's too complete, it's too constraining. Are you aware of sort of working within that space, within that continuum, and finding some kind of sweet spot or optimum for what you're trying to achieve?
Absolutely. I think I like what you're saying about, you know, the flexibility of what I can bring to something by using it as either a symbol or a metaphor. And I think as long as you're cognitive about what that object is, the more of it that you have with it, the less free your mind is to kind of link up with so many more different things. But it's actually, I can tell you, I've got actually this, and it's quite, this is the sculpture that I'm photographing on Wednesday, which is the Uterine Dreams piece that you've seen, and you'll see her broken legs here. And actually, they were supposed to be whole legs, and I broke them off by accident, and it was a really traumatic moment. And actually, when I recovered a day or so later, it actually was a far more powerful piece than it was before, because she had her lower legs and her feet, and it was just truncated at the top. And yeah, so I think I'm very attracted to objects that seem to be telling me that they've been broken in some way. And that really brings out my nurturing side. But if there's too much there, I can't work with it. You're absolutely right. There's too much that's already been said. I can't impose, or not impose, because I like to work with layers of metaphor and symbolism. And the more flexible my fragment is, the more flexible what I can associate with it. That's how I'm finding it anyway. And that's what gets my mind really excited. So actually, I've got a question for you, actually. Can I ask you a question? And that is, do you know very much about conversion disorder?
I don't actually know.
No, because I need to find out a lot more about that, because there are big similarities between Freud and his understanding of hysteria, and how conversion disorder is treated now since like in the last few years, actually. So anyway, it's just me being greedy there, but I shall find out myself.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Is this Übertragung, transference?
Sorry?
Is this what Freud would call Übertragung, transference?
Oh,
which leads into things like Stockholm syndrome and all the rest of it? Or I don't know the term conversion, though.
Conversion it's the mental condition in which a person has blindness, paralysis, or neurologic symptoms that cannot be explained by medical evaluation. So, but actually transference, when I talked about those broken little saints and Jesuses and things I found at the missionary sale that my father would encourage me to go and find, which is where all this fragmentation and sacred objects kind of started. That was total transference at the time, absolutely, without a doubt. And Yes, and it really worked for me. I find working with broken objects, well, it is part of how I'm regulating, you know, some very stressful things that have happened in my life. So it's utterly working to my objects.
It's interesting that you're focusing specifically on traumatic events, because I was just listening to Rob and thinking about DiMaggio's lovely piece. It's called The Feeling of What Happens, which you might enjoy, because it expresses very clearly that notion of cognition being integral and embodied. And, you know, and he was very much at the front end of what is now very well accepted, I think. But, you know, the notion of trauma is one of a stoppage, a halting in time, a shift in direction. And so it brings us back to process. I also wanted to pick back up on Alfred Gell, whose work I always love, and his work on agency has been, but it's been a raging debate, as well as the extent to which objects can embody agency in themselves, and it's divided anthropology into two camps, really, because Gell was very good. He kind of talked about how objects could be kind of like prosthetic extensions of the self, which is a very interesting notion of how the body extends outwards into the physical world. But he also looked at the capacity of things like Darwin canoes to sort of influence people, to act on them. But of course, the other side of this debate is that objects can't have agency themselves. They can only have the agency that we impute to them. So I think there's an interesting argument to be had about the sort of physical and cognitive capacities of things to act on the person through their material properties. But there's a sort of larger debate about the need for context, and that's really what I wanted to come back to, because, you know, there is always this gap, I think, for many of us in approaching artworks, is that we become hungry for the context. I mean, the reason I enjoyed your explanation so much is that it sort of unpacked what was in the artworks for me, and made it visible. But without an explanatory context, objects and photographs and visual material is necessarily interpreted sort of in the moment. So people will draw a surmise based on their own context. So I was quite interested in coming back to the notion of restoration, and how your work links more broadly with notions of restoration or restitution or social justice and so forth, because of course so many of these very important symbolic statues, as Nick pointed out, have been critiqued, but there's also this sort of other side of how do we then put that right. So your work is operating perhaps on one level as a personal level of restoration and rebuilding, but also in the capacity of objects and discourses around them to be part of the process of restitution and reconciliation. And so do you see it sort of heading, I mean, this is a more of a political direction as well as an emotional one. But then so much of the point of these things is there is something very satisfying about your healing of the objects that sits alongside a notion of justice and order being restored.
Yes. Lovely thoughts. Thank you. Because I'm reminded I was shortlisted for an artist in residence in Paris with a big US company called Art Slant, and it was to carve the arms of the Venus de Milo, and to do that with the Louvre. And when I was in LA, I was even in touch with the Greek embassy there, and they were going to open up the old Parian mines for me, and it just didn't happen, which was such a shame. But I that's a perfect case in point, because it's all so loaded, isn't it? All of that, and giving back. I mean, for me, sculptures are they're just voice pieces, aren't they? Really, they're just so loaded with what the artist meant. If they were, commissioned by state or patrons, their message is automatically assumed. So I think for a woman to carve the arms of the Venus de Milo again would be a really great thing to do.
Lovely.
I'd love to do that. It will happen one day.
I hope so. Laszlo, I can see you've got your there.
Okay, so there are just two thoughts that might be interesting to consider. So there is a lot of philosophical background from, at least my understanding is that there's a lot of philosophical and psychological background. And one way to dig it a little bit deeper is to connect more to the title of the seminar, which is the Uterine Dreams. Why? Because I think if you look at basically what Plato wrote about Socrates, Socrates actually confesses in these dialogues himself that what he's doing is midwifery. Midwifery, which is based on the idea that he's not in the childbearing age any longer.
That's right. Yes, I that's actually I know that line. It's wonderful, and I'm going to put that into my public lecture. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, and the other brief comment is on apparently on Ludmila's comments, but in the research we are able to do something similar in reconstructing and combining. I think one interesting example in science is basically the proof of Fermat's last theorem, which the bibliography is like 250 pages. Very clearly indicating that what it is basically a reconstruction of bits and fragments created over a century, and the big contribution is that someone comprehended the relationship between these bits and pieces, and this is one of the most highly publicized and most admired mathematical results in the last 20 years. So I think it's interesting to see that it is not something that is not happening, because the fragmentation and the disciplinarity in many of the sciences result in silos, which is exactly where I think IAS comes into the picture very big time, because finding connections between these silos and kind of recycling or reevaluating the results from a different perspective is very much the key idea of our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is it's going to go to so many different places now, all of this.
Well, I was just thinking about the sort of meta-discursive themes that your work could take across disciplines, because to some extent, in terms of restoring wholeness, you're talking about restoring a sense of order. And I think that is something, that is it's very much a sort of shared common theme that every discipline can tap into, is what is orderly, what is a notion of order, what is right. So you get this whole lovely debate in art about aesthetics being a concept of order, which like Howard Morley and so forth. That notion that if something is right, it is beautiful in whatever cultural terms, but that notion of orderliness and the world being at one with itself is something that carries through all kinds of disciplinary models of how they perceive the world, whether it's ecosystemic order or mental and emotional order, or even mathematical order. So I think that, if you wanted to get to the sort of really big themes that cut across disciplines, that notion of restoring an orderly world in some way would be one way to get at that.
Well, also, I would like to move as it gets further to its, written conclusion, is to pull it out of what's personal. I want to turn it into something much more universal. So I think that's a really nice direction to go.
And of course, the other end of that scale is that we haven't really talked about this, but as a feminist, I feel impelled to raise it, that there is an implicit critique in your work of violence against women and the multifarious ways in which that is done, which your sculptures make very, very clear at a physical and material level. Is that part of the political intention of your work?
It came about in a very subtle way. I mean, the work that I do that addresses violence, they I mentioned in my talk about, I kind of used my work as a code. And I do think that tourniquet is very obvious what that is about. But, you know, Bluebird, much more subtle. I mean, a lot of people didn't, well, it was basically, that was a sculpture when I was in Los Angeles, where I had no agency in my life at all. And I had lost my voice, and I was being utterly crushed by America, which is the American bluebird. So this was the code. And then as I was carving, there's a stain on the knee where the alabaster just had this iron in it. And of course, that just reminded me of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. So for me, it just, these are the layers that I really like to work with, but they were so people didn't understand that's what the sculpture was about until I explained. And then it was really clear. So I like things to be, we use the word beautiful, but fascinating, or peaceful I like peace in the work, peaceful to look at, but actually the layers of it are much darker than you might imagine. I don't know if I've answered your question there, but it didn't. I started off doing that kind of work simply for myself, and then people would ask me what the work was about, so I obviously had to say. And then I was invited to support a domestic violence charity in the States, actually, that have been so successful that they're moving into working with veterans dealing with trauma, because so many veterans go home and abuse their children, their wives, their violence in the home because of this, because of PTSD and all of that. So that was a project I was involved with, and they would refer to it, domestic violence, as the silent epidemic, and it's true. And so that's why I was so quiet and timid when I first began. But it's only as I become more sure in my motives, talking about that sincerity thing, is that I can really step up to doing the work, because it is emotionally demanding. I mean, to do the Uterine Dreams carvings, it's like really full on.
And do you find that people are challenged by that kind of work as well?
People are more silenced, actually, more fascinated. That we get conversations like this. I don't actually get many angry people. I get people who really want to engage and find out, and are fascinated, because it has a positive message. It does. And it's not supposed to be, I mean, yeah, it's, it's not a happy ending, but it's a different ending. Better.
That notion of restoration, I think, would be very appealing to a lot of people. Any other questions around the house? I just have one on materials as well, because you were clearly very thoughtful about the kinds of materials that you're using. And I'm personally very fascinated by the way that different materials mean different things. They embody concepts of, fluidity, stability, growth, flexibility, and so forth. So use of alabaster is a really interesting one. And I wondered if you'd like to say a little bit more about that.
Alabasters, I've become a bit of a champion for this material, because it was really revered. I mean, England was the most famous and revered exporter of alabaster, and it was the medievals, and because it doesn't form as boulders like it does in Italy, Spain, etc. It's compacted. There are very deep, massive seams of it, so it can be quarried and cut like marble is. And it was just an amazing quality. And of course, because of Mary Magdalene and all these associations, it just became this very, very sacred object in its own right, even uncarved. So for me, it just all links up symbolically.
Thank you. No, that's yes. Alabaster is very interesting in how it's made, how it's formed as well in that sense.
And I'd like to talk to you, Veronica, actually, when we have more time about the kind of whole water and alabaster.
Thank you. And just one last question from me, and then I'll round up and see if there's any from anyone else. It's about presence, because I've just been reading some of Elizabeth Edwards' work on photography. Again, she used to be a fellow at the IAS, but I've also known her for a while here in Oxford. And there's this wonderful concept, looking at visual material about the presence of the image, and of course, naturally the object as well. And in some ways, it's akin to notions of agency, but possibly without the divisive debates. But I just wonder if you use that concept at all in thinking about your work. It clearly has a presence, and I just wonder whether that's something that you would draw on as a way of thinking, because it also links with the notion of context as well, the extent to which objects and context, getting that balance between context and the thing speaking for itself as well.
I suppose I do superimpose what I would like the object to say for me. Mm-hmm. But then did you ever see the exhibition Treasures of Heaven at the British Museum, which was all about relics?
I know of it. I didn't get to it, but I know of it because I work with the BM quite often.
Yes. Well, it's something that I have to say I've kind of forgotten the whole question, Veronica. Could you just say that to me again?
Well, it's to do with the presence of the object or the image, the way in which it establishes itself in a particular context. They also had a very nice exhibition on Living with Gods, which had a lot of religious imagery, everything from sort of bark coffins from Australia through to Japanese dragons, you name it. But of course, I work with a lot of images of water beings, and they are often seen to exert a very particular presence in the world. But it's more of a concept used, I think, by people who work on images and photographs.
Yeah.
Ms. Miller can probably say a lot more about it than I could.
I mean, I can suggest something you might read about this. But I think Veronica's spot on about the notion of presence.
Yes.
Okay. So any other comments or thoughts from anybody? Questions? Well, I think you've given our seminar series a splendiferous start, Sarah. That was really lovely, and given me lots of interesting things to think about and so forth. And we're very much looking forward to your public lecture, and indeed to the exhibition and the catalogue and all the wonderful things that are going to come out of this collaboration. So many thanks for that, and thank you everybody for coming along and putting some good thoughts into the pot for everybody. And this discussion will continue over tea, over time and space, hopefully. And so we'll see you all at the next seminar, which is not for a little while yet, but we've got some stuff on 9th of November from Swan Park. So maybe welcome you all to that.
Excellent.
In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Very lovely to see you, Ludmilla. I haven't seen you for ages.
So, no, lovely to see you too.
Yeah, we'll have another cup of tea sometime soon. And
I hope so.
Yeah,
I'm very happily in Scotland these days, Veronica.
Oh, how sensible of you.
Yeah.
Best place to be.
But I do come down from time to time. So, and do keep me appraised of things that are going on in IAS, because I'm more than happy to participate if I can.
Oh no, that would be lovely. Of course, we're having a much quieter year than usual.
Yeah.
But somehow it's kept us as busy as ever. I don't quite know how that happens.
Yeah.
But it does. Okay, well, we look forward to reconvening in person at some point. All right, everybody, many thanks. Thank you again, Sarah. We'll talk.
And thanks to Ronan, who I know has been a real star with us.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you, Ronan.
Honestly, many thanks.
Thank
All right,
you. Bye. Thank you.